Hey there folks, it's Chris here from AmonProfessional.com. Let's get into it. Previously I spoke about the business case to be made for your content marketing strategy, and any content marketing strategy needs to start with a business case, otherwise it turns into random acts of content. Today I wanted to have a talk about the next stage in developing your content marketing strategy, which is to clearly define your audience. Any good content marketing strategy involves targeting a well understood and clearly defined audience. Because if you don't do that, then inevitably you will end up writing bland and uninteresting articles. And in a world where there are something like 1,388 blog posts a minute, dozens and dozens of hours of video produced a minute, and tens of thousands of images shared every minute, you need to be producing content that really resonates with a clearly defined audience. It has to be interesting enough to cut through the noise, and it has to be very clearly written for them. Otherwise, they're just not going to engage with it. They're not going to find it interesting enough in the sea of other options that they have available to them. Just think about your own consumption habits when it comes to articles or videos. My guess is that other than for entertainment purposes, if you're reading or consuming content for business purposes, that you look at it from the point of view of, is this worth my time to read? Is this something that's going to genuinely add value to me? And when you come across generic things, there's a good chance that you're actually not going to engage with it. You're just going to keep scrolling on your phone if you're doing this, or if you're on your computer, you're going to move on. So we need a well understood and clearly defined audience. Now, I hope you understand your audience well, because you're in practice, you have a practice area, and there are a few ways of defining your audience. We're going to come back to that in a sec. But the inevitable question that comes up when we're doing this kind of thing is, how narrow or broad should I go when it comes to defining my target audience? And that's a fair question. As a general rule of thumb, I suggest that people define their audience in a more narrow way than they are inclined to. So take a stab at it once and then narrow it down a bit more than what you're otherwise inclined to. And of course, the second thing to say about that is you can have more than one clearly defined and well understood audience. But as a general rule, once again, each piece of content you produce, no matter what it is, should probably be for a more narrow audience rather than for a broader audience. Again, coming back to the exact reason, people are more likely to engage with content that looks like it is specifically relevant for them in their particular position than they are for generic content that might or might not be relevant for them. So, how are we going to go about defining our audience? Because it can be a little bit tricky, of course, depending on your practice area. If you have a practice area that is very niche or an industry that is very specific, then defining your audience is quite straightforward. There are a few ways to do it, and I'm going to run through 5 different ways that you can define your audience today. And you might want to do a combination of these when you're coming up with who you are actually writing for and what they are like. The first and most obvious is your legal area that you practice in. What legal area do you practice in? Now, this is really just a starting point, because it helps you narrow the scope a little, but in my mind, it doesn't take you narrow enough. If you are a family law practitioner, then yes, okay, your audience is people who are embarking upon a family law situation of some kind, or who are in the middle of it. That's fair enough. But within that, it is very useful to be able to niche it down more, because your engagement levels will be different depending on who you are engaging with. Headlines that are attractive to women are probably not as attractive to men, and vice versa. You will use different writing styles, headlines, and topics for younger women or men than you would for older women or men. You will write differently and engage with people differently depending on whether they are at a higher socioeconomic level or a lower socioeconomic level. You need to position yourself differently, because of course your practice might be something that can be utilized by people in one situation but not another. And if you are writing in a way that's attractive to all of them, then you're not pre-qualifying your audience enough. When people engage with your content, you're going to get a lot of calls that you need to deal with from people who clearly are not suitable for the service that you provide. And so your content is a good way as well of pre-qualifying it, if it's very clear who you act for, what kind of people are your golden clients, these are the people you're defining right at the moment, then it will save you time and money at the end of the day, because you won't need to deal with engaging with people who just aren't ever going to ultimately use your services. So you can really help pre-qualify people in that way. Legal area is a place to start, but it's not the place to finish, I don't think. It generally leaves you too broad. Now, one way you can narrow that down is by looking at industry. What industry do you specialize in? And this is where things like building and construction come into place. Now, building and construction, of course, has various different things. It has workplace health and safety, it has contract, it has some particular statutes that apply to it, and it is a good industry. Sports law is an industry-based area of law. It's not necessarily a definable practice area, but it is more of an industry practice area. That's where sports law comes into play. Perhaps you are a specialist in acting for woodworking companies in some way. Perhaps you are embroiled in the cycling industry in some way. Perhaps you know everything there is to know about produce. Perhaps you know everything there is to know about agricultural industry. These are ways you can narrow down. So if you're a transactional lawyer, you help people buy and sell businesses. You might choose to focus your articles or your content marketing strategy on agricultural industry. Now, if you choose to take it further, of course, within agricultural industry, you could choose to go into different subsets of agriculture, because being an expert in fisheries is different to an expert in grain, is different to an expert in cattle or stock of some kind. These have different subtle variations. And so you might choose to have a content marketing strategy for each, or you might choose to go so narrow so that really you can saturate a particular industry with your expertise, because you become the ultimate expert in a much narrower field. But if you can capture a greater percentage of the work coming out of that, then it's worth going more narrow, because there might simply be less competitors. The broader you go, the more competitors you're going to have. But if you're specialized in a small but ultimately viable industry that you can really make some good ground in, then you may see the results as being worth it, even if it involves saying no to a bunch of other stuff over time. So industry is a good way to start to refine yourself, and you might choose to refine yourself quite narrow in terms of your content marketing strategy at least. It doesn't mean that you won't ever do work for those other industries. It might if you get busy enough, but it just means that's how you're positioning yourself to the market. Next, and you've probably thought about this, and I alluded to it before, is demographics. What age group are the people you're targeting? How much money do they earn? What is their level of education? Roughly, where do they live? Those sort of basic demographic information can be really helpful for you. Like I said, you are going to write differently for older people than younger people. You're going to use different language. You're going to use different mediums. And this is going to come up later, which is where you're going to put your content. That will be partly informed by how well you have defined your audience. So if you can define your audience and you can position yourself in a way that's actually going to be useful for a particular demographic but not for another demographic, then you're going to be able to write much more particularly to those. You can't necessarily effectively communicate the same way with a 20-year-old as you do with a 60-year-old. They use different language, they have different styles, they prefer different things, they ask different questions. And so if you were in a client conference, you would engage with those people very differently. But when you produce content, you need to think about it the same way. How are you going to define the demographic of your audience? Now, one way you may not have considered in splitting up your audience is by faith. What is their faith? Are they Christian? Are they Muslim? Are they Buddhist? Are they agnostic? Some of these groups, if you share an interest with this group, this might be a good way of positioning yourself, because people within those groups who share that common value with you will naturally be more trusting of you. Now, you can't fake it till you make it in this kind of stuff. You need to be genuinely engaged in that kind of area. But if you have a particular faith and can position yourself in that way, perhaps you will become a transactional lawyer who operates within the Christian faith, who operates for a lot of Christian people and businesses. There are a lot of events, business and otherwise, and opportunities to engage with and build trust with people within particular faith groups. So think about that. Do you share an interest in that area? Now, I know you don't necessarily want to get all sleazy within that kind of positioning, but if you are genuinely engaged with a group and you can position yourself in that way, then people will naturally place a higher degree of trust in you more automatically than they would than someone who shared no values with you at all. What about experience or hobbies? Things people do. If you cycle, is that a way you could position yourself? If you do triathlon, if you do marathons, there's a lot of sporting events coming out here. What if you are musical? What if you play the piano? I play the piano. What if you sing? What if you have some other hobby that, again, you are genuinely interested in that you can use to position yourself? Because these are opportunities, these are common tendrils of value that you can use, and you may want to define your audience by reference to those things as well. And again, I'm not saying you have to not practice for anyone else. If you are positioning yourself as the triathlon expert, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to not act for anyone who's not interested in triathlon. But it's just a way of positioning yourself to help refine the people that you are trying to reach and their interests and their values, and to share those common values with people. And the last one, we've touched on demographics, but what about psychographics? You have to look at the why as well as the what. So demographics answers the what. Age, education, location, that sort of stuff. Psychographics looks at the why. How are they feeling about their situation at the moment so far as it relates to your practice area? What are they going through? What emotions do they have? Because these are the things that will allow you to touch on those issues that feel like they are more personal for people than simply defining them by reference to their age. What are they experiencing internally right at the moment that you can start to use as trigger points to show that you empathize with their situation and that you understand it, that you have a good grasp of what they're going through and you can articulate it well and address their queries well? Because some people only have the emotion, they don't have the question to articulate. They know this is what I'm going through at the moment, but I don't know how to get to the other end. And if you can show that common point, then you can start to build that trust with them through the shared experience and the way in which you articulate their issues better than they could. You may have heard that before. That's a common statement when it comes to content marketing, which is if you can put into words the thing that someone was struggling to articulate better than they could, then you will really help that trust component in the whole liked, known, and trusted trifecta that I've spoken about before. So, those are some ways in which you can start to define your audience. What do you do with that information? Some people like to come up with an avatar or a persona for their particular customer in a particular situation. So let's take an example. We'll come back to our family law example. Maybe you decide to define your persona like this, and people give them names, believe it or not. So Susie. Susie is a 49-year-old. Her husband has been a professional. She has been a homemaker through her entire life. She has looked after their house. She has raised their children. The children have just left their home. She's just realized that her husband has lost interest in her and she has lost interest in him, and she has decided to commence a separation. At the moment, she's feeling confused about what's going on. She's not sure what to do with the rest of her life. She may still be in love with her husband, and she might want to get back together with him, but she's not sure. This might be who you are writing for. Maybe it's not. Maybe you change some of those details. Maybe in your practice, Susie is a 22-year-old. Maybe Susie is in fact Jack. Maybe Jack is a man. Maybe he is the professional on the other side of Susie's equation there. But if you can articulate that, who are they? What are they going through? What have their experiences been? Then you'll be able to target your content much better. Let's take a business example. Joe. Joe is starting an online business. Joe is a young entrepreneurial type. He has completed tertiary education. He has a debt associated with that tertiary education, and he wants to bootstrap himself. He does not want to get external funding. He wants to build an online business selling information products. A matter close to my heart. Jack has the technical expertise, but he has no legal expertise. He doesn't want to get bogged down in legal things right at the moment, but he wants to make sure he is adequately protected going forward so he doesn't do anything stupid. Jack needs your help to put together his business package for him in a cost-effective way. That might be your ideal client in your transactional business. Defining them in that way really helps the next step when you start to look at what content to actually produce. And we're going to come back to that. For the moment, I encourage you to go through this exercise. Define your audience. Ensure that you understand your audience. And if you don't, if your definition of your ideal target is something that you don't really well understand, then you need to do one of two things. You need to either listen a lot, start engaging and understanding your audience better, or you might need to tweak it to ensure that it is an audience that you really understand, because the next steps that we're going to embark upon in this process involve understanding your audience very well. Let me know, what is your clearly defined audience? Have a go at defining your persona in the comments. As always, tips for lawyers, modernprofessional.com/YouTube for the YouTube channel, and modernprofessional.com/iTunes for the iTunes channel. Subscribe, leave a comment, leave a ranking. I appreciate your feedback. And I'll see you next time.